Morning, everybody. I'm super excited to welcome Jason Glass, Global Head of Partner Sales from Sugar CRM. Jason, welcome.
Hey, great to be here. Really excited to chat with you today.
We're a Sugar partner. We love Sugar. We have multiple customers, and we're talking about some of the deals that we work together. But before we get going, I'd love to have you take a minute or two, introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, no, and again, thrilled to be here. Yeah, so Jason Glass, I've spent all my career in sales and the last 15 in sales and partnerships across a variety of enterprise, ERP, CRM, and HCM companies. So feel like I've got a good sense of the business trends that we've come from, and certainly the fast moving changes that are going on right now. But yeah, spent, like I said, the last 15 years really focused squarely on working with partners in resell, co-sell, and marketplace opportunities.
Amazing. And I'm also looking forward to chatting with you in our Denver panel, which is going to happen on June 12th. So looking forward to it.
Absolutely.
Looking at your background, you have worked from some amazing brand, ADP, Epicor, NetSuite, Oracle, like these are creme de la creme. So if we dial back a little bit, the entire journey in SaaS started with ERP, right? Well, it started with payroll, ERP, those kind of areas. And you kind of started at the epicenter of it. Now it's everywhere. So can you walk us through a little bit, like a couple of decades ago when you were starting, in this field, what was partner sales look like? Because most of the companies used to sell direct at that time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea of what partner is these days, right, is ever changing, right? I think you hear the term used interchangeably to describe a myriad of go-to-market motions, right? Whether it's a resell model, a traditional VAR model we used to call it, whether it's co-selling, what we used to call an alliance strategy motion or systems integrator motion, working with GSIs, large global systems integrators, or whether it's partnering today in some formal capacities with the hyperscalers, be it AWS, Google Cloud, the Azure Marketplace, right? And then even more informal relationships that permeate today across kind of the partner landscapes. Oftentimes, there's referral partner programs, there's industry partner programs with PE and VC being key focal points for vendors like us trying to identify opportunities to align with key influencers around the market. So it's changed a lot. And what was once a lot of kind of direct selling has naturally had to evolve. And I think a lot of that has come in line with the change in the buyer journey, right? And so, where direct sales oftentimes could garner the attention through things like tchotchke drops or events or pure cold call outreach, email sequencing. Today we have to be much more mindful of the dramatic impact that all these different players in the ecosystems really have with the end buyer and how the buyer wants to procure applications at this point. So certainly feel like I've, kind of seen it all a little bit. I watched one of your episodes earlier on. I think you and Jay were pontificating around partnerships being a little bit like a value meal, and absolutely resonated with me, trying to find your unique value wedge as a partner and the wedges that each of your respective partners play. So yeah, I've really seen it transform a lot from a pure direct sales play in enterprise software, whether you're selling to small business or mid-market, at the low enterprise or the large enterprise. I've seen it really deviate away into being more partner centric. Absolutely.
Awesome. So I do want to go back a little bit to your background, though. If we go in the early kind of 2000 when you were at ADP, I'm assuming it was mostly direct sales motion
It
at that
was.
time.
It,
But
it, it was. Yeah, it was a lot of direct selling, but we still were, it was the initial onset of trying to identify influencers in that space. At that time, you had benefit brokers were a key alternative option, as were banking relationships, given the nature of ADP and payroll. So you saw kind of quote unquote partnerships really start to take on a more meaningful impact, but it was largely direct sale focused. Absolutely.
what about Epicor? Epicor, was it direct and indirect too? Because they had a partner sales channel.
Yeah, so no, Epicor is a hybrid go-to-market model and has been for quite some time. Epicor has also gone through its own iterations through different PE ownership and kind of M&A activity, brought together a myriad of older brands that they've tried to kind of come together, bring together, and build a unified partner program. So you certainly see some of that unification in their model today, much more hybrid go to market model, an extensive sales team, but they've got an extensive and very strong partner network as well.
And NetSuite, that was pretty partner led from the beginning. They had a right decent alliance ecosystem. We're part of NetSuite even today. We know we connect with them. But can you tell us a little bit how NetSuite was?
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, kind of what partner means to you and how it's kind of used to define relationships can vary publisher to publisher, right? So, as you've mentioned, NetSuite's was early on in leveraging partnerships, but their primary go to market was really in two areas, kind of essentially a what they called the solution provider program, or something akin to a resell model very early on. And then they would also come to the table with an ISV ecosystem as well to strengthen, the options that they had in terms of positioning NetSuite into the mid-market client base. So they were focused on, those two avenues. So, the last full year of public operation before NetSuite was acquired by Oracle, reseller partners there, solution providers as they called them, represented 42% of top line revenue. So it was a huge strategy for NetSuite at that time, very much a hybrid model. And then, fast forward into the Oracle acquisition, and Oracle's mandate for how to really accelerate growth with NetSuite actually evolves a little bit more.
So from when you start thinking about as you go through this journey from direct to more, partner and then more ecosystem side, right? If you kind of dial back, are there attributes that you think started to develop over the last couple of decades that led to these plethora of go-to-market motion that you're talking about we have today that we didn't have a decade or two ago?
I mean, I think the first point I think that changed the game was the buyer journey. I mean, the buyer journey became so much more digital, so much more self-directed. You could acquire so much more information about a vendor than you ever could, before 2010. So, what you saw there was you had to pivot in your selling process and pivot in your partnering process to meet end buyers, where they needed to be met, right? They had already done a myriad of research around kind of product fit, feature functionality, right? And it required top sellers to be adept at really getting dialed into the problems that they ultimately were trying to solve for a customer versus talking about features and benefits, because the buyer had already done a lot of their own research up until then. I think that was the first major kind of inflection point in technology sales that I have certainly seen.
Well, why do you think that happened about 10 years ago?
Well, I think sales is a bit of an art, right? And I think, oftentimes there's a misnomer of sales, whether it's through a partner or whether it's sales through direct. There's oftentimes a misnomer that sales folks are stepping in, and their role is in fact to come in and talk, right? And at the end of the day, that can rub a lot of buyers the wrong way. And so I think, the major change at that point was it empowered buyers to start doing a lot of the research without having to listen to bad sales reps, right? And there were a lot of bad sales reps out there. I think that was largely the major driver initially, was to cut through, the narrative that a salesperson wanted to present, and really to start to acquire knowledge on your own before you ever even talked to a vendor. Think of how we all feel about stepping onto a car lot, right? We feel so much more empowered now to buy a car because there's so much information that we can acquire before we step foot on the lot, and then feel potentially vulnerable that a sales rep's going to lead us down the wrong path.
So I want to go back to the salesperson's persona and attribute a little bit. I did a podcast with Chris Orlov, who was VP of Sales at Gong, and he talked about, he had a statement rephrasing it. He said, you're not a life away from success, you're skills away from success.
Yeah.
So bundles of skills away. So when you think about this inflection point that happened, if we use the term like not so good salespeople, do you think it happened because they didn't keep up with the skill sets, or was it because like what changed that they were not effective anymore?
Well, I think ultimately the discipline of sales has been around since the beginning of time, right? And so I think what you have is a myriad of salespeople with different levels of training, knowledge, and understanding around human connection. And I think now more than ever, what you're seeing, today, which has transformed from 15 years ago, is a desire for every human to connect on some level, to ultimately to feel seen and to feel heard. That mindset in sales wasn't what we were trained about, when I grew up starting to sell, right? It was value based selling, but it was understanding features and function, understanding the buyer persona, trying to ask questions that would elicit value, but with the absence of truly connecting with the end buyer. And I think that has absolutely transformed. And the most talented reps that I know and the most talented partners that I know solve solutions by really understanding people.
That is fascinating. So, do you think the requirement for understanding the technology and product, like how to right size the deal, those skills are less relevant? Am I hearing from you it's more EQ than like IQ, or you need all of those? Like, what has happened to the requirement spec?
Well, I listen. It's a fascinating time that we live in, because I would argue sales today is far more EQ driven, because AI is already empowering partners, publishers to build sequencing, communication sequencing that talks about features and benefits and things of that nature. I think EQ now more than ever is critical in building strong sales cultures and driving sales effectiveness 100%.
That is amazing. So when you think about your journey, right? We went through up to NetSuite and Oracle, and then your role at Sugar leading the partner sales. COVID played a significant reset because we all went behind monitors, right? So while this shift was happening, that the buyers are a lot more educated online, they're coming in, and you're trying to respond to their emotional side of the purchase. It became even harder because you don't see them anymore. You're behind a Zoom call, right?
Exactly.
So what happened on skills development side? Where do you think the industry, and then we'll come to the partner skills because that's a whole different discussion. So from
Yeah.
a direct sales side, where do
Yeah.
you think things are at today?
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, if you talk to educational experts, right, and they will talk to you about the kind of communication gap that exists in elementary age students and middle and high school age students that went through school in a Zoom environment for that period of time during COVID, right, and the impact it's had in their development. I'd argue you have the same material parallel impact that happened in the sales profession, right? Where the rest of us that had moderate degrees of IQ and EQ could read the room, we read body language, we could really look around the conference table. We had to kind of completely change that format during the course of COVID and selling virtually on Zoom. And it really changed a lot of the landscape, because it robbed you of the ability to connect with the buyer in the same sorts of ways that you could have kind of pre Zoom world, for sure.
I did a podcast last week. It's not published yet, with Joni Wickline. She works with Ken Blanchard of that 1 Minute
Yeah.
Manager,
Yeah.
and a couple of other in organizations like Cubbies and etc. And we were talking about organizational development, and she mentioned 20 years ago it was about program management, like all like functions, time management, it
Yeah.
was about efficiency, right?
Yeah.
And she said now the focus is, instead of skills, it's about organizational development. It's very much centered around EQ. So it's fascinating to see, or hear from you from two different places. That's kind of where we are. So that must have made partners' life difficult, right? Because partners are so transactional. So when you move that element to partner sales, Like, what do you teach meditation to partners? Like, what does your enablement program look like today?
I here's what I would tell you. I think partners have largely been misunderstood. I think certainly in the larger publishers that I've worked with, right? And I would fully acknowledge I haven't lived in the world of startup consistently. That's not where I've grown up, right? It's largely been around kind of larger technology players. But I would argue that partners have long been misunderstood in terms of their value propositions. And so I think where large publishers got it wrong for years with partners was they weren't understanding the entire customer journey and the role that partners were playing there. And we had our own vision in terms of what we wanted out of a partner, right? It was just a cash register kind of transaction at the point of initial sale, maybe another transaction at renewal. And that was largely the quote unquote value that we would perceive a partner to drive, right, at a very high level. And it drove a lot of our KPIs. That is completely changing. And I think a lot of partners that have been around are starting to be recognized for the value that they actually play far beyond transaction. Now, not every partner, right? But I think more partners than not have always been much more to the end customer than we as a publisher representing a point solution or two really gave them credit for. They always saw it more holistically. They just had to figure out how to navigate our motions, our QBR, our requests for pipeline conversations, just to kind of manage that relationship. But I think they've always done a lot of great work, and now it's being recognized in the entire customer experience in a much different way.
So if I kind of double click on that, if you go back a couple of decades ago, a partner relatively meant a resell a person, right? Someone who resold your stuff, whether it's software, hardware, services. So therefore, the onboarding program looked like you got to go through 16 months of training and 14 months of this by the time you get to a sale, right?
Right.
What I'm hearing from you is that the partners have evolved tied to this buyer's journey. It's about where they touch at the point of value that Jay McBain talks about, these 28 moments of journey of the buyers, right?
Right. Yep.
So can you tell us a little bit about, as you saw this movie kind of get played out over the last couple of decades, where is this episode now? Like how, if you're mapping your go-to-market, I heard from you, it used to be inside out, now it needs to be outside in. Like what are the core elements for an organization like Sugar that you're looking at that need to be in place to support partner-led growth?
Well, I think, and I think it was Michelle McBain who talked about her old CEO's commentary on, I think, outside in thinking. She talked about, which is absolutely representative of, I think, what you have to do in a great partnering relationship today. It's about really uncovering how the partner views themselves, how they determine success, define success in their business, what their end business goals are, what their relationship touch points are, what their ultimate mission is. I think now more than ever, publishers have a deeper obligation and necessity to really understand partners in that way. Now, not every partner is incredibly sophisticated, but many are, because it's the nature of how you survive in entrepreneurship today. You have to continue to evolve and pivot. And I think far more partners than not have absolutely done that. So you focus in on understanding what's critical to those partners in terms of how they define themselves, their own unique brands, success for them. And then you figure out how to pivot and build partner programs, operations that align to the types of partners that exist out there and that naturally align into your own ICP.
So let's spend a few minutes on this, Jason, because this is kind of the crux of the conversation and challenges also most organizations have. So using your word, partner operations, if you're designing your organization today to kind of, let's say you inherit an ecosystem, which you did, and then you have to figure out, as you said, the skill clusters that ecosystem has that facilitates your go to market, right? Well, how do you design an organization to do that discovery? Is it happens once every 3 years, or is it continuous? Then how do you put the programs in place? Can you talk through the journey of that from a leader perspective, how you think it through?
Well, it's interesting because I think some would argue stepping in and building a program from scratch, right, in more of a startup or earlier stage company has its own benefits because you don't have the kind of death by a thousand paper cuts that often exists in inheriting a partner ecosystem where we've won together, we've lost together, right? But ultimately, those the losses resonate with partners and vendors far more than the wins do. So I think when you're inheriting a partner ecosystem, what you're trying to ascertain, not unlike inheriting a sales team, you're looking for your A players, your visionaries, your your sales team, your partners that clearly demonstrate a desire to evolve and grow, that are coachable, and that can clearly express and articulate what success is defined by, from their point of view. And I think at that point, then you're trying to architect, all right, in line with what our go to market is going to be moving forward, be it our ICP, be it our kind of territory strategy, our distribution strategy. Do we segment out where partners sell versus where our direct sellers sell? If we've got, a hybrid, type of structure, if you're inheriting something like that, I think ultimately at that point, what you're trying to uncover is how you kind of harmonize, a legacy partner ecosystem. And some of that is through, kind of small course corrections. I'm not a big believer in show up and blow up in partner leadership. I think it's about really taking the time to uncover, contextually understand the history of how a program and its partners have gotten to where they've gotten, and then understand kind of how to pivot, right? That Marshall Goldsmith book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, right? I think, a critical narrative in how to evaluate and how you should think about evaluating coming into a legacy partner ecosystem, and then kind of pivoting and through small course corrections, really trying to transition it into the next phase of growth.
So I want to go back to the point that you're mentioning before about, buyers' behavior change. Sellers need to be a lot more emotionally conscious today than they were. They were functionally conscious before. They need to be emotionally conscious now. So when you inherit a partner ecosystem, you're inheriting a large volume of transactions. When you look at companies like Sugars and others, $few $100 million at play. So you're in the middle of that stream, right? And then you go in there and say, hey, we got to be more emotionally conscious, right? Like, how do you start that conversation? What the program looks like? How do you realign? What is your expectation of change? How do you measure success? Can you walk us through that journey a little bit from the beginning to the end?
Yeah. I mean, first off, I think attitude reflects leadership, right? And so what you're looking for from your board, from a CEO, from your partner advisory council is to understand their general sentiment and attitude as it relates to each other. And you can find that out pretty quickly, right? You start asking questions, doing some research in that regard. You start to kind of uncover conscious and unconscious bias that exists in the history of those relationships together, right? And I think as you uncover those and get and ensure that partners feel heard, that the executive team that's maybe been around feels heard, that's where you start to uncover those opportunities for small course corrections, that can position you onto a greater road of success longer term. But I think so often what happens as partner leaders is we come in, we inherit, and then we're immediately, aligned to a set of OKRs and KPIs, to drive to, and they may not necessarily align with where the partners are at, where the business is even truly going, and not necessarily recognizing those patterns. So I think high EQ partner leaders come in and they do a lot of digging and a lot of listening on both sides of the fence, both their internal teams and their external partner relationships, to really uncover paths forward.
I spoke to Megan Moore from ServiceNow, she's VP of Worldwide Marketing. And, I was asking her about, because she also inherited an ecosystem like you, I was asking her, what was her first 90 days look like? I'm going to ask you the same question, and then let's see if we can contrast and compare a little bit. So can you walk us through when you come into a new role and you inherit this fast moving, high velocity, multiple partners, multiple stakeholder ecosystem? What does your sort of calendar look like the first week, the first 30 days, and the next night? Like, how do you plan that out?
I mean, my goal in any new role that I've ever taken on was to spend the first kind of subset of time, general, we'll say 30 days for this discussion, But as quickly as possible, I wanted to develop a contextual understanding of how a sales team I inherited, how a partner team I inherited, how a partner ecosystem I inherited was running, was behaving, what the challenges were, what the successes were. I wanted to spend time really developing a contextual understanding for the history and not to let it hamstring decision making going forward. But in great partnerships, it's those are predicated on ensuring each party feels heard and seen for what they bring to the table. I think that starts with a deep level understanding very early about how we got here and how we feel about why we're here right now and what type of alignment or misalignment do we have in terms of what the future looks like. I think that's critical to starting in the first 30 days. And I think off of that, then what you're looking for is, in my belief, is contribute early. Don't wait to be told to do something, right? What you're trying to do is identify early wins, right? Identifying opportunities where you can find early sales, early new partners, reinvigorate a partnership, reinvigorate a partner pipeline. You're looking for opportunities to make an impact really early through small course corrections and that contextual understanding of how the partner ecosystem got there. That's my general philosophy.
For someone like you who has an established career, in the old days we used to call it a Rolodex. Nowadays we call it a LinkedIn network. I'm sure when you switch positions, you get pinged. 1,000 people want to come and work with you, and then you have an internal organization need. You're meeting with the leadership team. You're meeting with your team. You have some sort of conflict crisis going on that you're inheriting. So walk us through. I really want to go back in a kind of a double clicked way. Like, how do you plan your first week and first 30 days? I understand as a framework what you walk me through, but walk us through operationally. You wake up and you do what?
Yeah, I mean it's about understanding how partners are viewed right away, right? I want to look at data. Data largely tells the story. And my goal starting right away is to understand the data. What's the customer acquisition cost? Do we know? What's the partner attrition rate? What's the partner renewal rate versus our internal renewal rates? I want to understand data points as quickly as possible. How profitable is the partner business versus the direct business, right? I want to look at those metrics and identify opportunities right away or risks right away. So I'm planning on looking at dashboards on a daily, right? That's the goal, is having data at my fingertips. Everybody wants that at this point because it really tells a story. And I'm no different, right? So I'm a big believer in dashboards and looking at the healthier business through metric driven data every day. It's not a weekly, not a quarterly. I would argue the one challenge about the tradition in partner management of QBRs is that people will wait for a quarter to identify if we're doing the right things, if we're performing well, right? And that's just too long this day and age. You have to be looking at the data, looking at your relationships with your partners on a weekly basis to pivot in quarter, not at the end of a quarter, not at the end of a fiscal year. You've got to be looking more minutely and moving really quick.
So speaking of data, and when you look at the ecosystems that you have dealt with, they have affiliates. There are consulting companies that just sort of put stuff in place but really don't perform like a system integrator. Then you have system integrator. Then you have managed providers. And then you have alliance partners. Then you have app marketplace, right? You have everything, right? So when you're looking through data, how do you filter that out? Who to focus on in that category? Do you have to go after all of them, or is there a sequence that you follow to go after them? Like, how did you prioritize?
Well, I tell you what, it's different now than it was a decade ago, right? I'm looking at what we're doing in marketplaces now, first and foremost, because it's largely the fastest way to scale in the market, right? From a partnership perspective, is what are we doing in marketplaces, both within our own marketplaces or within, the hyperscaler marketplaces that we have all come to know and love. That's where I'm looking first and foremost. Secondarily, I'm looking at the role that partners play in the entire customer journey, right? I can sacrifice front end resell if I see a partner is better aligned as a systems integrator, and we can keep them incrementally incentivized between the services attach rates that they enjoy by selling or maintaining our solution versus what they might want on the front end in trying to sell the solution and then move on. I think you've got to look at the reality of where business is today, where scale can happen quickly, right? And then pivot your partner strategy and prioritize accordingly.
And when you look at multi-product companies like Sugar or Oracle or Epicor, the lifecycle management of the customer is very, very important, right? Is that what you're saying? You want to focus on players that can keep on adding more value to the customer.
I think you have to. I think we are in that day and age, right? At the end of the day, a buyer today is looking at a completely different set of aspects around your solution or the business that you're in than they did 15 years ago. I mean, now more than ever, you have to be easy to integrate with. If you're not easy to integrate with and you don't offer a path to being one of many in a customer's tech stack because you're difficult to work with, you're out, right? You are done before you even get started. So the reality is you have to be thinking in different terms around, ultimately what the buyer's having to navigate in terms of potentially evaluating your solution or solutions. And that's just so much different than it was a decade ago.
So let's click on the word marketplace. So you're talking about hyperscalers, and I would love to kind of understand the Sugar and Oracle places also. So if you take, Microsoft or AWS or GCP, what does a transaction look like? How you put it together? I mean, there's a natural flow? You try to increase that, or you create new SKUs? But like, can you walk us through tactics wise? What would you do?
Well, so the tri-party play, the quad party play, the value meal, as I think you've referred to it in previous conversations, right, is really very indicative of the major opportunities that exist within the hyperscaler realm for sure, right? These are massive ISV ecosystems that have opened the door for all of us to build partnerships and build an offering across 3, 4, 5, 6 different applications without them necessarily being in our marketplace or us being in theirs, but we're all on AWS, for instance. And we can create a private offer for a client that enables them to access the value meal that they want with the pay structure that they desire. I mean, that is a win-win. And that's where you've got to be focusing is leveraging the tens of thousands of ISVs that exist in these hyperscaler marketplaces and figuring out how you create a value meal that's unique, to you and that other subset of partners, and then go after a market. Peripheral players going after the same ICP is absolutely a way you got to be thinking about the hyperscaler market opportunity.
So if you think about, 10 years ago, and for sure 20 years ago, companies built a product management, managed everything through a waterfall model. Things came out and 2 releases a year, and then you marketed it, sales sold it, and you did QBR 90 days later, and then you'd half year review. That was kind of the cycle, right? And today, what I'm hearing from you is it's much faster velocity. It's happening every day. Multiple player you have to, work with. You have to figure out your buyer's journey, map your bundle, get into the marketplace. How do you build an organization? This seems like a lot.
Well, I think therein lies opportunity with technological innovation that's going on with AI to simplify that process, right? I think what we're certainly seeing and what our partners are doing and what we've what I've certainly done with partners over the last number of years is leverage the tools that are already available, but now becoming more prolific to more easily build 3, 4, 5 party plays into email sequencing, sales sequencing, playbooks, data sheets, video, other all different forms of kind of consumptive opportunities for the end buyer to really consume. But it requires disciplined planning, an agreed upon approach, and obviously some natural alignment against something like a core ICP to really make all of that work at, expeditiously and certainly at scale.
So when you look at, let's say, we'll start at $100 million unit level, right? From a partner sales wise, if you look at that organization today, Jason, versus if you go back 10 years ago, do you have more headcount for that $100 million? You have less.
I mean, we as partner leaders are never talking about we've got too many people, right? It's just that's structurally that's just not the world we live in, and it's certainly not heading that direction with the growing role of AI in all facets of business, right? But I think the great thing there is a much broader recognition of partners as a key part of any business's go to market than there were 10 or 15 years ago, right? Less and less are the conversations around we need a partner ecosystem. More of the conversations are making sure you understand the P&L of running a partner business. So you're advocating to the board, you're advocating to your C-suite, ultimately where you need critical investment besides just simply saying, I need another headcount to handle the myriad of kind of tactical requests that come from partners. So much of that is getting automated. I mean, Google just released, their kind of some of their AI tools for partners, right? They're not the first, but they're certainly leading, and we're going to see a lot more of us using tools like that to expeditiously drive better enablement through automated video engagement, different playbooks that we can create in a matter of hours instead of months, building, designing, releasing with an traditional enablement model. So there's a lot of ways that we can navigate the pace of the market today.
So let's take the $100 million as a base, right? As a partner sales organization. Walk us through a little bit. What did the organization look like 10 years ago? And what does it look now? And where do you think it'll look like 3 years from now? And maybe the skills requirement a little bit also.
Yeah. So I think the headcount, honestly, I don't think the headcount's really, we're just on this, I think, kind of crossing the chasm into starting to look at reallocation of heads into fundamentally different things. I think if I'm honest about it, headcount 10 years ago versus headcount a year ago, I think largely is the same in terms of what they've been doing. You had partner marketing, you've got program operations, you've got channel salespeople, you've got alliance people, you've got somebody kind of run in and around running the marketplace, a developer, evangelist. Those roles have been here for 10 years plus, right? I think now what's happening is the role of a channel sales leader or an alliance manager has got to be as an operator, right? You've got to be thinking of the business from a metric standpoint. And I don't mean, how many leads are our reseller partners bringing into the funnel? What's our attach rate of our alliance partners? You got to be thinking in terms of what we talked about earlier, which is how to build multi-party plays that drive great business outcomes for a similar ICP. And that requires a different skill set. It really does. It's less of a tactical skill set than we've had in partnerships, I would argue, and much more strategic. And so what I'm seeing, what I have been hiring to over the last number of years is more technical oriented people to step into partnerships, because ultimately that is driving kind of the underlying fabric of success is strong technical integration with a multitude of partners. And you need folks in the trenches that understand that, how that all works and operates, who can communicate that way more so than ever. So I'd say the technical discipline is probably the greatest role increasing in terms of what I've seen versus the historical kind of traditional partner model.
So if you fast forward maybe, next 3 years, right? From a skill requirement perspective and automation wise, if you had to look at, in your crystal ball, how does that play out? What happens structurally? What picks up more velocity and what slows down more?
Well, listen, if your partner teams and your sales teams aren't leveraging AI, and I'm not talking just, chat GPT every day, if they're not using AI to be more effective in how they structure their time, how they review their notes, how they build meetings, how they think about developing products right? I'm speaking both internally and externally. Here, you're missing opportunity, right? Because at the end of the day, I think the transformation that's going on isn't about replacing people. It's about transforming people. And you see that in the partner landscape. You see partners doing it, and our partner personnel are going to have to do it. And so, folks who are really diving into how they can use tools like Lindy or understand tools like Make or N8N and build unique workflows to solve tactical challenges in how they manage partner relationships, or for partners and how they build successful outcomes in different ways for their end customers. If you're not doing that right now, you're going to get left behind. It's just a requirement for what business is going to need in the next 12 to 18 months. And we can't shy away from it.
So let's talk about some use cases, specific AI use cases, right? So if you take like top three of your, team's persona, can you kind of walk us through what they're using and what you'd like them to use?
Well, so first thing I started doing was actually doing a beta using a tool called Guide, GUID, and using Guide essentially to take all of this legacy information in our knowledge bases and start to build out a new enablement playbook every week. That's been the goal, right? Now it wasn't released up until now yet, but the goal is every week to create a new enablement guidebook, usual visual representation of historical knowledge that we have in a knowledge base. What's the point there? You've got to retool enablement, right? Enablement is arguably changing really every week, internally and externally. And so what you've got to be doing is ensuring you're pivoting content to support partners in the changing business landscape. You've got to use the tools available to do things like that. That is a very clear opportunity. I think using a tool like Slack, if you're not using Slack as a mechanism for communicating with partners externally and your internal sellers, if you've got a co-sell partnership program, again, you're missing an opportunity. These are tools that have been around for some time that drive a tremendous amount of efficiency. Those are a couple of just very high level use cases that if you're not using today, you should be thinking about kind of how to retool.
From the outreach side, going back to sort of selling kind of a value bundle, right? What tools are you giving to partners or thinking of giving to partners so that they can be more effective when they're trying to sell, a multi-solution to the install base? Like what's happening there, Jason?
So what I'm trying to, the problems that I'm kind of thinking about solving are how to help partners figure out how to bundle a solution with their other myriad of solutions, right? You've got to help solve that problem for them. If you completely leave it up to them, if you're not the most obvious answer, you're going to be left out in the cold, right? So you've got to help partners identify opportunities to build a cohesive solution set that includes you. And you've got to make it easy for them to figure out how to do that, right? And certainly some of these tools that we've talked about have the opportunity and potential to play a role in how partners retool and create value propositions that they can build recurring revenue models off of, which is what they're all looking to do.
So what I'm kind of hearing from you, and let me see if I can repack this and play this out and see if it makes sense. So, previously, or 10 or 20 years ago, using your word, software publishers, they built a thing and they kind of threw it out very similar to they threw hardware out, right? It just maybe got updated a little more. Today, what I'm hearing from you is that you have to figure out your motion on the customer buyer journey. Your product must fit into a stack. So connectivity is hugely important. You have to pull this meal plan together in a bundle one, bundle two, bundle three.
Yep.
So are we like kind of going back to the Jay McBain discussion? We're becoming like a franchise operator where I got to do a deal with a ketchup guy and a mustard guy and a Coke and napkin and put this thing together and give my franchise operator, which is my system integrator, and say, go put bundle one, bundle two. I mean, is that what you're trying to describe?
Well, I think it depends on where you fall in the landscape of the industry you compete in, right? So, listen, at my time at NetSuite, there was extensive AI already embedded within the product. Now, did we market it as AI at that time? No, it was facets of business intelligence and data warehousing and analytics, right? But it was using predictive modeling, machine learning, and what we are thinking about today and talking about as AI embedded in the application. And certainly, what that allows a company, like Oracle to do with the NetSuite product is to certainly own a much larger piece of the pie and not have to focus on finding a ketchup guy and a mustard guy and a salt guy and a pepper guy and a Coke guy, right? Maybe they just need to find a Coke guy and that's it, right? And so some of it is dependent on where you fit, in the industries that you play in. Certainly, buyers are more apt today to procure a myriad of other point solutions versus what we sold on for a long time, which is kind of one throat to choke. If you could sell that to somebody, they loved that model. Well, the challenge that exists today is integration has become far more easy than it once was, and so you can compete, with five or six other players, but you've got to make that process easy for the end customer. So that requires, that type of consultative strategic approach with a subset of partners that again align naturally into the market that you want to serve.
So I have one last question on the bundle, then I want to talk a little bit about leadership before we wrap up. So if you take in the multiple bundles that you have your sugar ecosystem today, and you're a process automation company, AI is playing a huge role. Sugar made multiple announcements in this area. What are the one or two major deployment category that you're seeing on the customer side that solutions, AI solutions, are getting traction?
Oh, well, I think certainly, and Sugar's been on the front of this, right, with the Sales Eye integration, but, CRM as we know it is completely transforming, right? And part of what is transforming CRM is generative AI and the focus on taking data that you already have and empowering sellers to be able to identify in a much quicker and more effective capacity where they can position, right? So certainly looking at things like revenue intelligence and generative AI capabilities within the confines of the product set are what everybody's trying to do to strengthen their product. Every buyer, whether they understand what they're asking for or not, wants to know what you're doing with AI. What's your AI strategy? And so you have to be able to articulate what in fact that looks like and how you're empowering an end customer and their tech stack to be more effective to drive, stronger business outcomes, profitability, top line revenue, whatever the case may be.
So if I kind of go back to where from started, you have had an amazing journey. You're still on the road. You're going, leadership wise, you have a very progressive, background. You've moved up and up. So what drove you, Jason, through this incredible amount of changes that you kind of described over the last 45 minutes and what you foresee ahead? What drives you?
Well, I think great leaders are lifelong learners, right? I think the best leaders that I've ever had have a desire to serve, right? I consider being a servant centric leader to be kind of the pinnacle of leadership. Agency in the service of others is something that I really subscribe to. And so I think where sales has gotten that wrong to a certain degree, I've used that in my career as a salient point in what's important to me and what type of opportunity I look for in my own career and the way that I treat the people that I work with and work for and who have worked for me is ultimately high EQ leadership and that's probably what's been most important to me. I don't maybe not now, but I used to consider myself the atypical sales leader. I think that's changing. I think high EQ leadership has started to take center stage, and I am thrilled to see it.
Can you define a couple of attributes of that?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I think when you focus on people and what's important to them, we used to call it just talent development, right? But I think I mentioned it earlier. When you lead with vulnerability, what you're trying to do is break down barriers and really understand at a material level what is important to people beyond money, especially in the sales profession, right? The old adage was, salespeople only cared about money, and when you know and have worked in the profession forever, what you start to uncover is there's far more things that are important to us. And so, I think one key attribute that I've, tried to utilize my entire leadership career is the desire to really uncover and to understand, right? And that comes through asking, doing research, uncovering what's important to your people, what's important to the people that you work for outside the business context. Understanding intrinsic motivation, I think, is a super important quality. And then I think being willing, having a high degree of humility to be able to say, I don't always know what the right answer is, right? But I will lead with authenticity. I think, those two kind of salient points stick with me in my kind of leadership journey.
Amazing. Well, Jason, the hour just went by. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to seeing you in Denver. But this has been terrific. And
Yeah.
thank you.
Thanks for having me.